Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Chiefskate, and welcome to Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want stunning, tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, we'll show you how to save money on your miniatures painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And on today's video, we're actually going to show you guys how to cheaply and quickly paint up Xandire's Truthseekers for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. As you can see, this is what the end result looks like for these miniatures, and by following the tips and techniques and materials that we suggest, we can help you save $141.20 by only spending $36.89 for the cheaper craft paints to paint your miniatures using our method. So that being said, let's go and talk about how to quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up Xandire's Truthseekers. So right off the bat, the first thing you have to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures and also texture your bases and also prime your miniatures and start doing the base coating on your miniatures when it comes to the flesh portions of them. Now, I will apologize for this. I kind of jumped the gun a little bit when I started working on this project. I actually started assembling, texturing, and priming and painting before I realized, oh snap, I forgot to take pictures. I do apologize for that. I'm not a professional YouTuber. So the first thing you gotta do, of course, is to assemble Xandire's. Is it Xandire or Xandire? I don't know. I'm just going to go Xandire. I'm just going to say that. So Xandire, she's going to be the, this warband is actually a Warhammer's Underworld warband. So because of these guys are actually very easy to put together, they're just kind of push fits. So that's the nice part about that. However, though, I did want to work a little bit on the bases because a lot of the bases were not missing kind of texture. And I want to make these guys kind of blend in with a Mordheim warband that I plan on using these miniatures for in another video series that we're going to do. So because I decided to put some texturing on top of the basing they already have in order to make that kind of coherent for those guys. So for the basing, it's really simple. All you gotta do is you just gotta paint your bases with wood glue, with whatever substance that you want to actually put the texturing on. I just dust it real quick with some sand from my backyard. I let it dry, then I make a slurry mixture, a 50-50 mixture between wood glue and water, and I apply it like a wash all over the texturing I just added to the bases. Let it dry so that way it makes an airtight sealant so it doesn't come flaking off. And then of course I prime my miniatures using flat white Rust-Oleum primer that you can get at your local Walmart. Now I do this for the human members of this warband. Now as for like the little falcon looking creature that's on the side there, I use Rust-Oleum's deep teal spray paint from Walmart. I do that once over real quick to give it a good solid base coat because it kind of saves me some time on painting the actual falcon thing blue, and that's the reason why I did that. Now once you guys of course are done with your prime, the first thing you gotta do, of course, you gotta paint the flesh. Now luckily there's only two miniatures with flesh on these miniatures, and that's the face. That's the guy armed with a giant warhammer and the character carrying the lantern. You just pick down 2 thin layers of flesh by Underworlds paint and you're ready to move on. Now once you guys are done with your base coat, next thing you gotta do, of course, is do dry brushing. Now dry brushing is an important step because what it does, it creates the illusion of depth in your miniatures by creating highlights as well as recesses. What ends up happening is that the pigments of the paint actually adhere to the raised surface of the miniature, creating highlights while that darker color stays in the recesses. So for this dry brushing, I like to use Delta Cerancoats Peaches and Cream. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby. I do it once over on the faces, that way you can see a lot of things that we couldn't see before. So things like the nose, the brow, the facial features, that sort of thing. Now I will warn you guys, you will have this kind of chalky kind of pastel kind of texturing on your miniatures when you get done doing dry brushing, but don't worry, that process will be smoothed out when we get to the oil washing stage. So the next detail I worked on, of course, is on the trunk that the little falcon thing is flying on. So in order to pick out that detail, I just put 2 thin coats of Burnt Umber by Underworlds paint. It's a beautiful, rich, dark brown color I get at my local Walmart. Just put 2 thin coats directly onto that trunk, and we're ready to move on to our next detail. And that next detail we're going to work on real quick is on some of the clothing for these characters. So these guys are Stormcast Eternal, so they do have some fabric beneath their huge chunky plate armor. So in order to bring out that detail, we're going to paint those trousers as well as the sleeves of their shirts in 2 thin layers of pigment paint. The reason why is because it's going to contrast nicely with the silvery paint job that we get in these miniatures. At the same time, it's a good shadowy color anyway, so it just kind of adds to the overall shadowy look of these fighters. The next thing we're going to do real quick is to dry brush the trunk that this falcon is flying upon. So we're going to dry brush it real quick with some Territorial Beige. You can get it at your local Walmart. It's a nice kind of palish brown color, kind of like a darker khaki color that also does a really good job when you dry brush it with Burnt Umber. And because I thought that the dry brushing was a little light, a little dark on this one, I decided to do another level of dry brushing with Khaki by Underworlds paint. Just a quick once over real fast on the tree trunks. That way you have those nice rich colors, making it look like that tree trunk is, you know, more lifelike than it actually is. Now for the 3 Stormcast Eternal characters, for all the fabric that we painted in pavement earlier before, we're going to dry brush that real quick with some Folk Arts Pale Gray. You guys at your local Walmart, and the reason why we're doing this is that we can bring a lot of the details we couldn't see in the fabric before. Things like the individual folds of the fabric, the little charms, for example, that hangs past their belts onto the fabric, that sort of thing. And the next detail we're going to work on are some of the plate armor that's on these characters. And you might be thinking, Commander Cheapskate, why are you starting with the metallic steps so early? And the reason why is because there really isn't that many colors on these miniatures. Well, not many colors I plan on using on these miniatures anyways. These guys are mainly metallic because they are Stormcast Eternals. So in order to bring out some of those details, for example, like when you paint your miniatures, what you tend to want to do is you want to kind of paint your miniatures as if you're dressing them. So you start with the flesh first, and you put in layers of clothing they wear on. So you start with the base layer and work your way out, and that's traditionally how you do it. And so because these guys are Stormcast Eternal, a lot of their clothing is metallic. For example, the scale mail that the lantern carrier is carrying on the right hand side, as well as the archer there in the center, I just basically use Anita's acrylic aged antique copper in order to get this kind of bronzy kind of look for these guys, just because I thought it looked really nice for them. So I painted it on the scales of the lantern holder on the right hand side, the masked helmet, as well as the bow and arrow that is being carried by the archer in the middle, and same thing with the double-handed hammer wielder who's over there on the left hand side as well. Just put 2 thin base coats on this and get that nice aged copper look, and we're ready to work on our next detail. And the next detail, of course, we're going to work on is the little falcon creature. We're going to pick out its talons as well as its beak. We're just going to use 2 thin layers of King's Gold by Apple Paint. It's a nice, rich, dark color for that detail. And we're just going to put 2 thin base coats on it and ready to move on. And then, of course, we're going to do exactly the same thing for the lantern wielder on the right-hand side there. We're just going to paint that lantern in 2 thin coats of King's Gold as well to make it look like it's got like a little bit of a glowing effect going on. So the next major detail we're working on these guys are on their armor. These guys are Stormcast Eternals, so most of their details are basically just armor plating is what it is. And I decided to paint these guys just a little bit differently. Usually I like to use Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art in order to get like this kind of dark metallic color onto the armor, but this time around I wanted something a little bit brighter. I went with Anniversary Silver by Folk Art. It's a nice bright silver paint that has a little bit of a blue tinge to it, and I think that's how they kind of make the difference between the Gunmetal Gray as well as the Anniversary Silver. I wanted these guys to be a little bit more shiny and a little bit more visible, just because we're going to put some oil wash on these guys. It's going to darken it down quite a bit, so I didn't want to make them too dark. I want to make it a little bit more awe-inspiring. After all, these guys are supposed to be Middenheim mercenaries for a Mordheim warband. That's the reason why I decided to go with the brighter color, just to make them look like they're a little bit more with it, if that makes sense. So because of that, I'm going to paint all their armor suits with the same color. I use 2 thin coats. I use it for their pauldrons, for example, their breastplates. I also use it for the thigh plates. I don't know what you'd call those. That kind of protects their legs, as well as their kneecaps, as well as their boots, their gauntlets, as well as their elbow pads. I painted all those details on 2 thin layers of Anniversary Silver. Now the next major detail we're going to paint next are on their cloaks, and as weird as it may sound, their cloaks actually make up a large portion of these characters' details. They wrap them around their shoulders as well as their backs, so in order to get that kind of brownish kind of golden color with their cloaks, I decided to use 2 thin layers of Anita's acrylic moccasin brown. I just put that 2 thin layers on that. Now you do have to be a little bit careful, especially with these guys' shoulders as well as their necks, because their cloaks are around those areas, so you want to make sure it doesn't spill over into the Anniversary Silver. If it does go there though, it's not a big problem. You just kind of neaten up with that Anniversary Silver to cover it back up again. And actually, here's a shot of the back of their cloaks as well, just to kind of give you guys an indication of what it looks like. Now, I do admit I did forget to take a picture of the next step. The next step was that I do a dry brush using Territorial Beige on these cloaks, and I forgot to take a photo of it. I do apologize. Once again, I am not a professional YouTuber, so I do apologize for that mistake. In fact, on this picture, you can basically see that little bit of dry brushing that I did with the Territorial Beige already. So I do apologize for missing that step. But the next step we're going to talk about, of course, are the leather goods these characters are wearing. And these guys are wearing some leather goods. For example, belts, as well as the scabbard of the sword of the lantern carrier, as well as the cording of the bow of the archer there on the left-hand side. So we're just going to pick that on 2 thin layers of some burnt umber real quick and make it nice and dark. And we're actually not going to dry brush those. We're going to leave them nice and dark on purpose, so that way it contrasts nicely with the rest of the characters. So now that we're done with that, we're going to start working on some of the fine details on these miniatures, and this is the part where I do change my mind. So first of all, on the pauldrons for that little icon that they have for their chamber, I think, chapter, let's be honest, I mean, these guys are Space Marines, so whatever their Age of Sigmar chapter equivalent is on their, I think that's their right-hand shoulder. For that detail, I just picked out 2 thin layers of True Blue by Folk Art. You can visit your local Walmart. It's a nice, rich blue color, which is a nice alternative to that ultramarine blue that all these characters wear for Warhammer 40k. I think it's called Macragge Blue, I think is what it's called. So I just put 2 thin layers around the pauldrons real quick. If I'd make any mistakes, I just needed it up with some anniversary silver, so it's not a big deal. And I also decided to change my mind on the color of the scabbard of the sword wielder as well. I thought that burnt umber was a little too dark, so I decided to actually brighten it up with some true blue as well. So the nice part about this technique, of course, was the cheapskate method. Because we are using cheap craft paints, if you do make a mistake, it's not that big a deal because the paints are cheap, and you could just, correct your mistake as well. She also has a little bit of like a belt hanging on her left-hand side as well, and I also picked up that detail in true blue as well. The next detail we're going to work on these characters are on some of their other pauldrons as well. Now, originally I was just going to do the whole silver paint job, and then I was feeling kind of lazy at the time I was painting it, and I realized that's not the way to go, Commander Cheapskate, stop being lazy. So because I decided to add some gold element to their armors as well. For example, the ornate pauldron that they had that looks like hawk and a lion and I think a bear, I decided to pick that out in some 2 thin layers of some deca art called Emperor's Gold. It's a beautiful rich color that looks shockingly resembling Retributor armor. It's actually quite nice. I used that for their shoulder pads that are more ornate. I also did things like some of the jewelry they're wearing, some of the plates on their thigh plates, their kneecaps, their elbows, that sort of thing, in order to bring out that detail as well. And if you also notice the archer on the right hand side, their helmet looks a lot different now. I decided to pick that out in 2 thin layers of gunmetal gray, but I'll talk about that when we get down later on in the slides. As you're painting on your miniatures, you really don't understand what they're going to look like 100% of the time, so when you go through the process, you realize, okay, they might be wanting to add some additional details, so that's exactly what I did. Things like the hilt of the sword, for example, and little jewelry iconography detailing on the scabbard, those kind of materials. The next detail we worked on, of course, are some of the copper pieces on these miniatures as well. For example, the guy with the Warhammer that I painted with antique copper earlier, I didn't think it was an eye-catching enough detail, so I decided to slap 2 layers of copper by folk art directly onto that handle to make it look cooler. I did that. For example, the scabbard of the sword, the hilt, and the handle of the sword wielder there on the center of the paper, the center of the screen, I decided to pick out that detail as well. Same thing with the shafts of the arrows on the archer there on the right-hand side. And the very last detail I decided to pick out was to use gunmetal gray by folk art. I used this on a couple of details. So for example, on the archer, I use it for like the little blade as well as the fletching, where the fletching usually would be on that bow and arrow. I also use it on the, I guess you would call them bracers, I guess is what you call them on the bow and arrow, which is the part that's near the handle, so that way they can punch people with it, as well as the anchoring points for the string. Same thing with the gunmetal gray for the swordsman in the middle. I decided to pick that detail out with her lantern that she's carrying out, and finally the guy on the left-hand side, the head of his warhammer. So now that we've done the miniatures, the next thing we gotta do, of course, is to do the base coating on the bases themselves. And I decided to try a little bit of an experiment on this one. One of my commenters said, instead of adding 2 thin coats of paint, why don't you just glaze the bases real quick, since, the white undercoating will bleed through, and you could use that for your miniatures in order to help you out with the dry brushing. So I decided to try that. So I decided to put like a combination of 50-50 water with pigment paint, and I applied it like a wash all over the bases. I did 2 thin layers of that glazing, and it actually looks really cool. It looks like it actually kind of creates that dry brushing look on the miniatures already. However, though, I didn't like the way that it didn't look strong enough, the dry brushing on that. So I will, of course, do a dry brush later on, but it was a quick little experiment to see exactly how that would look. I forgot the commenter who gave me that suggestion. I do apologize, but if you were the one who actually gave me that idea, please let me know in the comments box below, because it was a really cool technique, and I do appreciate that. So for the bases, I just dry brush them real quick with some pale gray by folk art, just bring out those details you couldn't see before, so like the individual grains of sand, the masonry that these guys are standing on, and it actually looks really nice with that additional dry brushing on top of it. So even though the glazing idea was a really good idea, I decided to add the dry brushing anyways, just to make it look more pronounced. And now that we're done with our bases, the next step we gotta do, of course, is an oil wash. So when it comes to an oil wash for our quick paint method, a lot of people like to use Army Painter Strong Tone in order to achieve this effect, which is perfectly fine. It does exactly as advertised. The only problem though is that Army Painter Strong Tone costs about $37.99 a can, while a can of mid-wax poly shades in Mission Oak does exactly the same thing, but only costs $6.99 at Walmart. So because of that, what you can do is you can use the mid-wax poly shades kind of like a wash. You can apply it all over the entirety of the miniature, as well as the bases as well. Now this oil washing does a couple of things. The first thing that it does, of course, is that it seeps directly into the recesses to bring a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. Things like the folds in the fabric, for example, the texturing of the bases, the feathers of the hawk, those kind of things. The second thing that it also does as well is that it blends out our transitions between our base coats as well as our dry brushing, so it makes it much more smoother and remove that kind of chalky kind of pastel look these guys had earlier. And the last thing it does, of course, it also darkens down the color of the miniatures as well with the paint jobs that we use. That's the reason why we use such bright colors in the first place, so that way when we take that oil wash into account, it will darken down that value. For example, if you look at these guys' armor, it's not as brilliantly bluish steel looking as it was before. It's much more subdued, and it's kind of nice. Now you do have to wait for this stuff to wait and dry and cure for about 24 hours because it does have polyurethane in it, which is quite nice because it will protect your miniatures from fading as well as chipping. And of course, it does leave a high gloss finish, so I decided to use a can of matte varnish spray on these guys real quick to kind of mute down the sheen. You could of course skip that step if you want to because it's completely optional. And the very last detail we gotta do, of course, is to rim the bases. I use 2 thin coats of Skyline by Folk Art. It's a beautiful grayish blue color that I use for all of these skirmish miniatures in the studio's collection. I use it for our Mordheim as well as for our Necromunda miniatures just because it looks like this kind of urban kind of look to it. So once you're done with that, we are pretty much over with. And as you can see, this is the end result of our miniatures. As you can see on the picture, we brought these guys up to a beautiful tabletop standard without breaking the bank as well by only spending a grand total of $36.89. And that's assuming, of course, that you purchase everything that we just talked about for the very first time. So now that we talked about our cheapskate method and how much it's going to cost you to paint your miniatures that way, let's talk about the materials that you need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using those name brand products instead. So from Citadel as well as Army Painter, you need to buy a can of Corax White Spray. It's going to cost you $24, as well as the colors Evelyn Sunset, Canadian Flesh Tone, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Eshin Gray, Flayed One Flesh, XV88, Rust Gray, Ultramon Gray, McCrag Blue, and all those colors are going to cost you $4.55. You also need to buy a bottle of Sons of Horus Green, Wildwood, Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bill, Ironbreaker, and Retributor Armor, and all those cost $7.80 a piece, as well as a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, as well as a can of as well as a Army Painter basing set, which does cost you $18.99. And assuming that you're purchasing all these materials for the very first time, you have the grand total investment of $178.09 to paint up your miniatures the same way we did, but using the name brand paints instead. Now, when you take our cheapskate total of $36.89 and subtract it from the Citadel as well as Army Painter total, you end up with a grand total savings of $141.20. So if you guys are looking for a way to save money on your miniatures war painting hobby, may I suggest switching to cheaper craft paints. After all, you get similar results with a fraction of the price as opposed to Citadel as well as Army Painter. So for those of you guys who are struggling with buying expensive paints, or you're just starting out looking for a great way to start into the miniatures wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching those craft paints because you will save buckets of money, which you can use to do other things like purchase miniatures. So with that being said, you guys, that's good for this video. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all this greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this video, guys. I'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.